Okay, so it feels like every time we turn around, there's another headline about some new technology that's going to revolutionize education, right? Like we just about wrapped our heads around how online learning and all those digital platforms were shaking things up. And now here comes AI promising this whole other level of disruption and transformation.
It is mind-boggling how fast things are changing, and it's hard to keep up with all of it, for sure. So like you said, the big question on everyone's mind is what is actually happening in schools with these new AI tools? Are teachers using them? How is it making a real difference for students? I mean, it's a lot to unpack.
Exactly. And that's what we're going to be digging into today. We've been poring over this really interesting new report from RAND. They released it pretty recently, and it's based on some fresh data they collected in spring 2024. It's from two of their big national surveys, the American Instructional Resources Surveys, that's ARS for teachers, and the American Mathematics Educator Study AMES for principals. So basically, we're getting a really good look at how AI is being used, or not used, right across the country in public schools.
Yeah, you got it. This deep dive is all about getting a real snapshot of the AI landscape in schools right now. And it's not a small sample size either, right? I mean, we're talking about responses from over 9,000 teachers and more than 3,600 principals. So that gives us a pretty solid foundation, a broad perspective to really understand how AI is being adopted.
Exactly. So you and I are going to walk through the key findings, sort through what it all means, and then we're going to be asking, what does this mean for you? For the students, for the teachers, and just for anyone interested in the future of education, really.
Right on. And, one thing that really struck me when I was going through this data, going through this report, is that it's easy to get caught up in the hype and think, oh, AI is everywhere. But what this data actually shows is a much more nuanced picture. It's not a simple yes or no answer. There's a lot of variation in how much AI is being used. So I think that's what we really want to tease out today. Where is it being used? Where is it not? And why?
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so to kick things off, let's get to the chase. That's what everyone wants to know, right? Are teachers actually using AI for their teaching? And if so, how many?
So the first big finding that kind of jumped out at us is that approximately 1 in 4 teachers said they used AI tools for either planning their lessons or for their actual teaching during the last school year. So that was the 2023-2024 school year. That's not a majority by any means, but it's a pretty significant number, don't you think?
1 in 4. Yeah, that definitely got my attention. I'm thinking back, though, didn't we see some earlier numbers on AI adoption in schools? I feel like there was a survey or something back in the fall.
You're right, there was. There was a survey done in fall 2023, and it did suggest a slightly lower rate of AI adoption among teachers. Now, it's tough to make a direct comparison between the two. The teacher populations might have been different, and how the questions were phrased and all that. But it does seem like things could be moving in the direction of increased use. What's really interesting, though, is that almost 2/3 of teachers in this more recent RAND survey said they'd at least heard of AI tools for instruction, even if they weren't using them themselves. That shows a growing awareness, at the very least, even if everyone's not on board quite yet.
So maybe a little hesitant or waiting to see how things shake out. But they've definitely heard the buzz. Now, this report actually broke down who's using AI in more detail, right? Like by subject, grade level, all of that.
Yeah, it did. And it gets really interesting when you start looking at those variations. For example, they found that nearly 40% of English language arts, so ELA teachers and science teachers, said they were using AI. Compare that to general elementary education teachers and math teachers, where it was more like 20% using AI. That's a pretty big difference. Makes you wonder what's going on there.
It does. Is there something about ELA and science that makes AI more appealing, maybe? Or are there just more tools out there geared toward those subjects right now?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
It's hard to say for sure from just this data. But yeah, you can picture how AI could be helpful in ELA, right? Think generating creative writing prompts, maybe analyzing student essays, or even tailoring reading materials to different skill levels.
And in science, I could see it being used to analyze data sets, maybe run simulations, things like that.
Exactly. So it's something to keep an eye on for sure. Now, as far as grade levels go, the report found that secondary teachers, those teaching grades 6 through 12, were about twice as likely to be using AI compared to elementary teachers. We're looking at 34% versus 18%. So again, a pretty big gap.
You have to wonder, is that because older students are better equipped to use AI directly? Or is it more about the curriculum at the secondary level being more suitable for AI applications?
Probably a combination of things, to be honest. And then there's also the teacher factor. The report found that teachers with less experience, newer teachers, in other words, were more likely to be using AI compared to teachers who had been in the classroom for a while.
Oh, that's interesting. So are newer teachers just more comfortable with technology in general, maybe? Or is there something else at play there?
Well, they've certainly grown up with more technology in their lives, right?
Okay.
So maybe there's less of a learning curve for them. But it could also be that newer teachers are more likely to be seeking out innovative teaching methods, trying new things, really looking to shake things up in the classroom.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then, of course, we can't talk about education without talking about the socioeconomic context, right? Did the report look at how AI use varied across different types of schools?
They did, and I think this is one of the most important findings, honestly. They found that teachers in lower poverty schools, so those schools where less than 25% of students qualify for free or reduced price lunch, those teachers were more likely to be using AI than teachers in higher poverty schools. And that raises some really big questions about equity and access.
Absolutely, because if AI is going to be this transformative force in education, we needed to make sure it's reaching all students, not just those in more affluent communities.
100% agree. So we're seeing that it's not just a random scattering of AI use across the board. Who's using it, how they're using it, it's all connected to these bigger factors like the subject, the grade level, the teacher's experience, and the socioeconomic context of the school. It's complex.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot more nuanced than just, is AI being used in schools? It's who's using it, how are they using it, and what does that tell us about the bigger picture?
Exactly. Now let's talk about the how a bit more. So for those teachers who are using AI, that 1 in 4, what are they actually doing with it?
Yeah, let's get into the nitty-gritty. How's it showing up in their daily work?
So the report found that most AI-using teachers, about 64% of them, were mainly using it for instructional planning. So the behind-the-scenes work of teaching, getting ready for those lessons.
So more of a tool for the teacher than for the students directly, at least for now?
Yeah, it seems that way. Only about 11% of those teachers said they were introducing AI tools directly to students without using it for their own planning first. And then there are about 25% who are doing a bit of both, using it for their own planning and also having students use it.
Interesting. And were there any differences in how elementary and secondary teachers were using AI for planning?
Yes, actually. Elementary teachers were more likely to use AI specifically for planning their ELA instruction, and they were also more likely to have their students use AI tools in their ELA classes. For secondary teachers, it was pretty common for both ELA and science teachers to use AI for planning. Something like 90% of them were doing that. But when it came to having students actually use AI, it was a bit lower, about 35-37% for ELA, science, and even math teachers. Although math teachers were actually a little more likely to use AI only with students, not for their own planning. That's kind of a curious finding.
It is. Maybe they see AI as more of a tool for student practice or something, like for generating math problems or providing immediate feedback.
Could be. No, another thing they looked at was how often teachers who are using AI are actually using it. Is it a daily thing?
Mm-hmm.
Weekly? Monthly? And it turns out that most of them are only using it every once in a while. Over half of the teachers using AI for planning, about 53%, said they only did so once a month or less. And only a tiny fraction, like 4% of all teachers, were using it every week.
So it's more of a dipping your toes in the water kind of thing for most teachers, not a full-on dive.
Yeah, exactly. Although there was an interesting twist when they looked at the frequency of use in different poverty level schools. It turned out that among teachers in the highest poverty schools who were using AI for planning, a higher percentage of them were using it weekly compared to teachers in the lowest poverty schools, 25% versus 16%. That's kind of surprising.
It is. You'd almost expect it to be the other way around, right? With the more affluent schools having more access to technology and all that. What do you think that might be about?
It's hard to say for sure, but it makes you wonder if teachers in under-resourced schools are seeing AI as a particularly valuable tool to help them address some of the challenges they face. Maybe they're seeing it as a way to personalize learning, provide more targeted support, or even just lighten their workload.
That makes a lot of sense. And speaking of other tools, how does the use of these newer AI tools like ChatGPT compare to the use of more established online resources that teachers have been using for years? Things like YouTube and Teachers Pay Teachers.
Yeah, good point. So it turns out that platforms like YouTube and Teachers Pay Teachers are still way more popular, at least in terms of weekly use. Like, for example, in ELA, you had 38% of teachers using YouTube weekly and a whopping 48% using Teachers Pay Teachers every week. Compared to that, ChatGPT was only being used weekly by something like 5 to 7% of teachers, depending on the subject. However, the report also points out that a lot of those other educational platforms that teachers already love, things like Khan Academy, iReady, and even Kahoots,
Yeah.
they're starting to build AI into their existing features.
So even if teachers aren't specifically using ChatGPT or something like that, they might still be interacting with AI without even realizing it.
Exactly. So it's kind of sneaky in that way, almost like it's weaving itself into the fabric of education without us even noticing.
It's kind of like how AI is being used in so many other aspects of our lives now, right? Like those personalized recommendations you get on shopping websites or streaming services. It's AI behind the scenes.
Exactly. So it's something to be aware of, for sure. Okay, so we've talked about who's using AI, how often, and in a broad sense, what they're using it for. Let's get even more specific. What are teachers actually doing with AI when they're planning their lessons? Because the report included some really interesting details from those open-ended responses from teachers.
Yes, let's hear about that. What were they saying?
So the most common thing teachers mentioned this was about 40% of them was using AI to generate lesson materials. And that broke down into a few key areas. A lot of them were using it to create student-facing assignments or activities, things like discussion questions to get the kids thinking and talking, essay prompts that are actually interesting and relevant, or even word problems that use themes from popular video games like Minecraft and Fortnite.
Oh, that's clever. Tap into what the kids are already into. So it's not just about generating content. It's about making it engaging and relevant.
Exactly. And then about 25% of the teachers said they were using AI to help them generate actual lesson plans or just to brainstorm ideas when they were feeling stuck. Like, how can I teach this concept in a new way? Or how can I make this lesson more fun?
It's almost like having a brainstorming partner, but it's AI.
Yeah, kind of. And then another 30% said they were using it to create other types of resources like model papers, so students can see what a good essay or lab report looks like, or informational texts and passages for close reading activities. Some were even creating slideshow presentations with the help of AI.
It sounds like AI is taking on the role of a kind of teaching assistant, helping teachers get all those materials together.
Yeah, and potentially saving them a lot of time and effort in the process, right? Because let's be honest, that prep work can be really time-consuming.
For sure. Now, what about assessment? How are teachers using AI to figure out if students are actually learning?
So about 20% of the teachers who said they were using AI for planning were also using it for assessment. And for the most part, they were focused on creating quizzes, tests, and rubrics to evaluate student work. But there was a smaller group, mostly secondary ELA teachers, who were using AI tools specifically for grading and giving feedback on student writing. They even mentioned specific platforms they were using like Writable, CoGrader, Magic School AI, Brisk, and Class Companion. So those tools might have some interesting features that streamline the feedback process.
It sounds like there's a lot of potential there to make grading more efficient and maybe even more personalized. Now, what about differentiation? Because we all know that students learn at different paces and have different needs. Is AI helping teachers address that?
Yeah, differentiation was another big one. About 10% of the teachers who were using AI for planning said they were using it to differentiate instruction. And a lot of them were focused on adjusting the reading level of text, often using tools like DFID and ChatGPT to make things either easier or more challenging for certain students.
So making sure everyone can access the material at a level that's appropriate for them.
Right. And some were even using AI to differentiate things like word problems, writing prompts, and even entire lesson plans. About a third of the teachers who were using AI for differentiation said they were specifically using it to support certain groups of students, like students who are struggling, multilingual learners, students with IEPs, and gifted students. ELA teachers were more likely to be doing this kind of differentiation, though. Very few math teachers mentioned using AI for that purpose.
That's interesting. Maybe the tools just aren't quite there yet for math differentiation, or maybe teachers are still figuring out how best to apply AI in that area. So beyond those core teaching tasks, planning lessons, assessing learning, differentiating instruction, were teachers using AI for any of those administrative tasks that can really eat up their time?
Yeah, actually, about 100 teachers mentioned using AI for admin stuff. Things like writing emails to parents, drafting report card comments, writing recommendation letters for students, and even putting together those substitute teacher plans.
Oh man, I can only imagine how helpful AI would be for that. Those tasks can be such a time suck.
Totally. And when teachers are bogged down with those things, it takes away from the time they have to actually teach and interact with students.
Right.
So if AI can help free up some of that time, that's a huge win.
It definitely is. Now, what about the students themselves? Were there any instances of teachers actually having their students use AI tools directly?
Yes, there were. About 50 teachers in the survey said they were incorporating AI use directly into their teaching. So this included having students use adaptive learning platforms, the ones that tailor the content to each student's individual needs. Some teachers were teaching their students how to use AI to generate their own practice problems, which is kind of cool. Others were using it for brainstorming ideas for projects, doing research, editing, writing, and even teaching students how to critically evaluate writing that was generated by AI. Like, is this text actually accurate? Is it biased? Does it make sense? Which I think is a really important skill for students to learn in this day and age.
Especially with so much information and misinformation floating around online. Being able to critically evaluate what you're reading is more important than ever. Now, were there any other interesting ways that teachers were using AI that maybe weren't as common but still worth mentioning?
Yeah, there were a few. A small number of teachers said they were using AI to check for plagiarism, to make sure their students weren't copying stuff from the internet. And some were using it to translate text, which is really helpful for students who are learning English or for communicating with families who speak other languages.
Those are all great applications. So it seems like teachers are really finding a lot of different ways to use AI. Now, we've talked about what they're doing with it, but what about their overall impressions? Do they feel like AI is actually helpful? Or are there some major drawbacks that they're encountering?
Yeah, it's always good to get that user feedback, right? So about 100 teachers specifically mentioned that they found AI useful for personalizing learning experiences for their students, like tailoring those activities, coming up with new ideas when they're feeling stuck, and streamlining all those repetitive tasks that take up so much time.
So taking some of the busy work off their plates and giving them more time to focus on the things that really matter.
Exactly. And they were very clear about the fact that they don't see AI as replacing teachers. They see it more as a tool to make their jobs easier and more effective.
Okay, that makes sense. But I'm sure it's not all sunshine and roses. Were there any challenges or concerns that teachers brought up?
Oh yeah, for sure. There were about 40 teachers who specifically mentioned some of the drawbacks of using AI. And the biggest concern was the need to be really careful about the quality of the output. Because sometimes AI can generate stuff that's just plain wrong or biased or just not very well written. So teachers are finding that they often have to spend time revising and editing the AI-generated stuff to make it actually usable.
That makes sense. AI is still under development, right? So you can't just blindly trust everything it spits out. You have to use your own judgment and expertise.
Exactly. And some teachers were actually using those AI errors as teaching moments for their students. Like, hey, look, AI isn't perfect. You have to think critically about what it's telling you.
Oh, I love that. Turning those mistakes into learning opportunities. Now let's switch gears and talk about the principals, because the report found that they were actually using AI even more than teachers.
Yeah, that's right. A majority of principals, 58% of them, said they were using AI tools in their jobs. And like the teachers, they were using it for all sorts of things.
So what were the principals doing with AI? What were some of the main ways they were using it?
Well, the most common use by far was for drafting communications. About half of the principals who said they were using AI were using it to help them write emails, letters to parents, school newsletters, speeches, announcements, social media posts, flyers, memos, presentations, you name it. They were also using it to proofread and edit their writing and just make sure everything sounded clear and professional.
It makes sense that principals would be drawn to those communication tools, right? Their jobs are all about communication, keeping everyone informed and on the same page.
For sure. And then about 20% of principals said they were using AI for other types of administrative tasks. So this included things like writing recommendation letters for their staff, developing school policies like the student handbook or the school's mission statement, helping with strategic planning, organizing school events, creating bell schedules, all those really important behind-the-scenes things that keep a school running smoothly.
It sounds like AI could be a huge time saver for principals who are already juggling a million things at once.
Yeah, exactly. And then there was another interesting finding about how principals were using AI to support their teachers. About 15% of them said they were doing this in a few different ways. So this included using AI to help with the hiring process, like writing job descriptions and coming up with interview questions. They were also using it to help with teacher evaluations, creating templates, summarizing observation notes, and drafting those evaluation reports.
So it's not just principals using AI for their own tasks, they're also using it to support the people they work with.
Exactly. And they were even using it to help with professional development, like planning activities for staff meetings and coming up with ideas for professional learning opportunities.
Oh, that's cool. So it's kind of like AI is becoming this behind-the-scenes support system for the entire school community.
I like how you put that. Now, some principals were also involved in using AI for instructional purposes, either directly in the classroom or by helping their teachers integrate it into their teaching. We're talking about 150 principals here. They described using AI to generate learning activities, help with differentiation, guide teachers on using AI for lesson planning, unpack curriculum standards, and support the use of personalized learning tools.
So it sounds like some principals are really taking on a leadership role in terms of AI adoption. They're not just using it themselves, they're also helping their staff figure out how to use it effectively.
Definitely. And finally, just like the teachers, some principals were using AI for their own professional learning. About 50 of them said they were using it to research topics related to their work, like best practices in school leadership or new education policies. And a few mentioned using it for things like transcribing meetings and translating documents.
So again, a really diverse range of uses. It's amazing how AI is finding its way into all these different aspects of education. Now, the report also shed some light on disparities in AI use and guidance, right? Were there any noticeable differences between schools based on their socioeconomic context?
Sadly, yes. The patterns were very similar to what we saw with teachers. Principals in the highest poverty schools were less likely to report using AI compared to those in more affluent schools. Only 54% said they were using it, compared to 62% in the lowest poverty schools. This reinforces the concerns we've already talked about regarding equitable access and the potential for AI to widen existing gaps.
Exactly. If we want AI to be a force for good in education, we need to make sure it's benefiting all students, not just those who are already privileged.
Absolutely. And access to the technology itself is only part of the equation, right? What about guidance and support? How are principals and teachers learning how to use AI effectively and responsibly?
That's a great question. Did the report say anything about that?
It did, and this is where things get a bit concerning. Only 18% of principals said their school or district provided any kind of formal guidance on AI use for teachers, students, or staff. And, as you might expect, that number was even lower in higher poverty schools, only 13% compared to 25% in the lowest poverty schools. So there's a big gap there.
That's really worrying. If educators don't have the support and training they need to use AI effectively, it could end up doing more harm than good.
Exactly. And even when guidance was provided, it was more likely to be focused on teachers than on students or other staff, which again raises some questions about whether we're really thinking holistically about how AI is going to impact the entire school community.
So is anyone trying to address this lack of guidance? Are schools and districts working on developing policies and support systems?
The good news is that some of them are. The report found that 23% of principals said their school or district was in the process of developing some kind of AI policies or guidance. But you guessed it, the rates were lower in those higher poverty schools, so there's still a long way to go.
Yeah, it seems like those schools that are already struggling are also the ones that are being left behind when it comes to AI. It's a vicious cycle. So for those principals who are trying to learn more about AI and how to use it, where are they turning for information and support?
Well, it turns out they're mostly relying on each other. Other principals were the most common source of guidance that principals mentioned. They were also getting information from professional associations, their supervisors or district staff, and even their own teachers.
That makes sense. Teachers are often on the front lines of using this technology in the classroom, so they have valuable insights to share.
Definitely. And then social media was another source of information that principals mentioned. It's interesting, though, that principals in higher poverty schools were less likely to seek guidance from most of these sources, and more likely to say they had never sought guidance at all. But there was one really encouraging finding: principals who were actively seeking out information and support about AI were much more likely to be using it themselves. So professional development really does seem to make a difference.
It absolutely does. You can't expect people to just figure this stuff out on their own. They need training, resources, and a supportive community to help them navigate this new landscape. So finally, what were some of the main concerns that principals had about using AI in their schools? What were they worried about?
Not surprisingly, the biggest concern was the lack of professional development opportunities focused specifically on AI. They also expressed concerns about data privacy and security, and just general uncertainty about how to use AI effectively in their roles.
Those are all valid concerns, and it highlights the need for clear guidelines, robust training programs, and ongoing support from districts and policymakers.
I couldn't agree more. Now, very few principals were worried that AI might make them less efficient, which is interesting. But principals in those higher poverty schools did express greater concern about data privacy and the lack of guidance from their district, which makes sense given the limited resources they often have to work with.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then there were also some broader concerns that came up, like the ethical implications of using AI and just the overall quality and accuracy of the output.
Exactly. So it's not just about the technical aspects of using AI, it's also about the ethical considerations and the potential impact on students, teachers, and the school community as a whole.
Wow, we've covered a lot of ground today. This report has been really eye-opening. So let's wrap things up by summarizing the key takeaways for our listeners, because this is all pretty important stuff.
Agreed. So takeaway number one, AI is no longer some futuristic concept in education. It's happening right now. A significant number of teachers and principals are already using it in their work. However, that adoption is happening unevenly. It's influenced by things like the subject being taught, the grade level, the teacher's experience, and, as we've discussed at length, the socioeconomic context of the school.
And the ways teachers and principals are using AI are different too, right? Teachers are more focused on those core instructional tasks, like planning lessons, creating materials, assessing learning, and differentiating instruction, while principals are more drawn to those communication and administrative tools that help them manage their crazy workload.
Exactly. And we can't overemphasize the importance of those disparities we've uncovered between lower and higher poverty schools. Schools with more resources are more likely to have access to AI tools, and they're also more likely to have the training and support they need to use them effectively. And that's a huge problem that needs to be addressed if we want AI to be a force for equity in education.
Agreed. We need to make sure that AI is benefiting all students, not just those who are already privileged. And finally, while there's definitely a lot of excitement about the potential of AI in education, there are also a lot of valid concerns about its impact on teaching, learning, and the overall school experience.
Yes, absolutely. We need to be having those tough conversations about data privacy, ethical use, and the potential unintended consequences of AI.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to make sure we're providing educators with the training and support they need to use AI responsibly and effectively.
I think the biggest takeaway for me is that AI is a tool, and like any tool, it can be used for good or for bad. It's up to us to decide how we want to use it in education and to make sure that it's serving the needs of all students.
I couldn't have said it better myself. Now, this all leads to a really important question that we want to leave you, our listener, to ponder. AI is evolving at an incredible pace, right? And it's not just in education, it's in every aspect of our lives. So how can we as educators, policymakers, parents, community members, all of us, how can we ensure that AI's integration into our schools is done thoughtfully, ethically, and in a way that truly benefits all students?
That's the challenge before us. It's not going to be easy, but it's a conversation we need to be having right now, because the future of education and the future of our students depends on it.
Couldn't agree more.
So keep thinking, keep questioning, and keep pushing for an education system that works for everyone, with or without AI.
Well said. And on that note, that's a wrap for our deep dive today. Thanks for joining us.
See you next time.